We're going to do George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st President of the United States, serves from 1989 to 1993. He is a one-term president. Much of Bush's administration is going to be taken over by foreign affairs. There's going to be many events going on in the world at this time that's going to demand his attention. So first off, we're going to start with China. In 1989, students in China, many of them had an American education, they had come over to the U.S. to receive an education and then went back to China, they started to demand that their government become less communist, that they start to open up the society and give them more freedoms. This movement coalesced in a place in the capital of China, Beijing, and a square is called Tiananmen Square. And so hundreds of thousands of students occupied the square. They built lady democracy, lady freedom out of paper mache and different things, and they're demanding from their government that they listen to them and give them more reform, more freedom. The government, of course, is a totalitarian regime. It's a communist regime, and so the government sends in tanks. And we have this image captured on television of this lonely one Chinese demonstrator trying to stop the tanks as they come into the square, because he knows if the tanks do come into the square, then there's going to be lots of death and destruction. So he's imploring these army guys in these tanks. He goes, just stop. And so we see this very brave, iconic photograph of Tiananmen Square massacre, where before the tanks get in and do their shooting, we have one protester trying to stop them. And for a time, the tanks just didn't know what to do, and he bravely stops them, but eventually they do roll in, and they do beat up and disperse the crowd. And so we see the Chinese government cracks down on the movement. So it doesn't go anywhere, except we see that there is this movement of young people in the late 1980s for they're sick of the Cold War. They want it to end. They want more freedom and democracy around the world. The next place we see this is in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, if you remember, has been under the control of the communists of the Soviet Union ever since the end of World War II. We know it as the Eastern Bloc, and all of those countries you see on the map in the bottom right-hand corner have been behind the Iron Curtain. So in 1989, the same year as in Tiananmen Square, we see workers and young people do this mass movement called Solidarity. And they are asking for their government to end communism, create more economic opportunities for them, more freedom, more equality. And we see these big movements, and the Soviet Union does not crack down on this movement. Something that we've talked about in our previous lectures, Gorbachev, he doesn't want to make an enemy of the United States, so he lets this movement happen. No Soviet tanks roll in, plus he's broke anyway. And so we see that these students get emboldened, these workers emboldened. They know that the government's not going to crack down on them, and eventually they demand and get the overthrow of the communist government in Poland in 1989. Now, when the Soviet Union is either too broke or doesn't want to make an enemy of the United States to respond, we see that this inspires all those other Eastern Bloc countries, and one by one, quickly, we see the Eastern Bloc countries fall. We see communism just overthrown in Poland and in Romania and Hungary, and even in East Germany. We see that the crowds just attack the Berlin Wall, the symbol of the Cold War, and they get some sledgehammers, and they knock the wall down. And the whole world is looking at this because it seems apparent that the Cold War is coming to an end before our eyes. Well, what about the USSR itself? Well, the USSR is a big collection, just like the United States, of one country with many little states in it. And that's what the USSR was. And so the biggest state within the USSR is Russia and Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, etc. And so we see that Gorbachev, again, we talked about in our last lecture that he is not willing to continue to bring communists together to rule as a dictator. And so when the people in all of these different states of the Soviet Union see Eastern Europe breaking away, they figure, well, why not us? And so ethnic groups around the Soviet Union, they start to also break away from the Soviet Union. And so in 1991, we see the Soviet Union just disintegrate. So that leaves many different countries where Russia used to be. And so we have Boris Yeltsin. He is the leader, not of the Soviet Union. It doesn't exist anymore. But he is the leader of the largest state that used to be the Soviet Union, Russia. And so Boris Yeltsin and George Bush signed a historic treaty. It's called the START Treaty, a START II treaty. And it's going to reduce both America's and Russia's nuclear arsenals by 2/3, so a significant decrease in tensions between our two countries because the Cold War is over. Why do we need these weapons anymore? So we see that the world is certainly changing, and so President Bush, he makes a big deal about how he's very optimistic that maybe with communism going away and the Cold War no longer around, we will have an attempt for a new world order. Maybe we can reshape the world to be democratic. It seems to be spreading around the world. I mean, if democracy can now be found in Russia, where can't it be found? And so he thinks that in this new world order, we're going to have democracy around the world, capitalism, and if we have democratic, capitalistic countries, he can't imagine any more major wars. And so he thinks we're going to have a peaceful world, this new, very hopeful world order. Of course, we're human beings, and we're not going to go along without war. And so that very same year, where George Bush is hoping for a new world order of peace and harmony, we have a crisis in the Middle East once again. It's the Persian Gulf crisis. Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq, we see him pictured in the top right-hand corner. His country is broke. He's just fought a really long war with his neighbor Iran. He's broke, and he's having a tough time paying his bills. And so he realizes that even though his country has oil, there's a country just southeast of him called Kuwait, and they have a lot of oil as well. So if he invades Kuwait, he can take over their oil supplies and use that oil to pay off his debts. But also, he could then be in a perfect position to invade Saudi Arabia, which is just south of Kuwait. And maybe then, not only will he be able to pay off his debts, but he'll control most of the oil in the world. If he controls the oil in these three countries, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, he will be able to be a very powerful man, and who knows, maybe even take over the rest of the Middle East, since he's going to have all this money from this oil. So he masses his troops. After he's taken Kuwait, he masses his troops on the Saudi Arabian border in preparation for invading that country as well. Now, Bush then decides we can't let this happen, and so he employs the Carter Doctrine, which, of course, says that we cannot let anybody control the Middle East because the U.S. economy depends on that oil. And so the United States is going to go to the UN, and we ask for the UN to condemn Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Kuwait. So we see a close-up of the map here between Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. And he gets the United States leads a coalition of nations that come to Saudi Arabia, and we place troops all along the northern Saudi Arabia border, and just across the border is the Iraqi army represented in red on this map. And you can see from this map, it is a coalition. It's not just the United States, England, France, so forth. They're there as well. And it's about 500,000 American troops and about 200,000 UN allies that we have. So it's a very large operation. And then what we do is the United States will invade Kuwait and southern Iraq in an attempt to liberate the country of Kuwait, and that's called Operation Desert Storm. We win it easily. The war only lasts about 4 days. The United States military might, along with its allies, just overwhelms the Iraqi army. So you can see this picture that as the United States Army moves into Kuwait, Saddam Hussein, lit a lot of the oil wells on fire because he didn't want us to have it. But we use these really technologically advanced weapons called smart bombs. You'll see one in the top of the slide. You see a camera on there. They use lasers and satellite communications to drop a bomb exactly where we want it. And this is more than Saddam Hussein has, and it just is a quick victory over Saddam Hussein. Now, while we have him, George Bush wants to continue the war and not just liberate Kuwait, but also go into Iraq and get rid of this dictator who was threatening the United States' interests. But the UN and our allies said, look, we supported you to liberate Kuwait, but we don't want this to be an American war of conquest. That's not going to look good in the world, and we're not going to do it. And so George Bush is forced to yes, liberate Kuwait, but then pull his troops out of Iraq and leave Saddam Hussein intact in his country. And as we'll find out in future lectures, that is going to cause problems, especially for George Bush's son, who will be president in a few years. So that's it for his foreign policy. A lot going on. Let's now talk about his domestic policy. So Bush's domestic policy, one of the things he does, now Bush is a Republican, and so he promised the American people, before we get into what number one here is, he promises them that he is going to continue Reagan's ideas of shrinking the size of the government, getting rid of more regulation. He promises America's no new taxes. In fact, he says, as a campaign pledge, he said, read my lips. no new taxes. He's very emphatic about it, and that, of course, helps him get elected. So those are all the promises he makes. And so one of the things he does when he's president is he actually creates a program that's kind of a regulatory program. He signs the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. It is protecting a new group of Americans that we haven't protected before. It's Americans with physical and mental disabilities. And they have been protesting because there are many places they cannot go and jobs they cannot have that they're not going to get hired for, because they say that they're being discriminated against because of their physical and mental disabilities. And so when he signs this into law, it does transform the look of America, but we see the government is getting big, and they're going to force businesses to comply with the ADA. And so if you're a bus company, you can't just have a regular steps to get into your bus. That is discriminatory against people with handicaps, and so now you have to pay for the expense of putting in a ramp. If you're a building, you have to put in ramps instead of stairs. You have to have these, what you see in the middle of the screen, these push buttons that'll have an automatic door opening for you. So if you're in a wheelchair, it's much easier to get into the building. And now we see the beginnings also near businesses of handicapped parking spaces. So it makes it easier for people with handicaps and disabilities to just function in their everyday life. And so we see all of this as a victory for people with disabilities, but it's not typically something that we would see from a Republican Party who says that they want to reduce regulation, reduce costs on business. And so he is a little bit alienating some of the people in his party, but overall, like I said, it's a positive for people with disabilities. Next, the nomination of Clarence Thomas. So there is going to be a Supreme Court opening during George Bush's time in office, and he nominates an African-American, Clarence Thomas, to be a Supreme Court justice. Now, the Senate has to approve this nomination. He does this because Clarence Thomas is a dedicated Republican, so he wants to reward him for that, but also he is an African-American, and maybe they can get some African-American votes by doing this. But during his Senate hearings, when the Senate is asking him questions, seeing if they really wanted to be on the Supreme Court, a lady comes forward. Her name is Anita Hill, and she says, look, when I used to work with Clarence Thomas, he sexually harassed me in the workplace. He made me uncomfortable. He made kinds of propositions and comments to me, and I didn't appreciate it, and he should not be able to do that. And so this nomination hearing becomes a national spectacle. People watch the thing on TV, they find out what's going on, and it's some pretty graphic information that's portrayed of what Anita Hill claims Clarence Thomas did to her. And so this opens up a big issue in America. It's an issue that has really not been addressed in society, sexual harassment in the workplace. In the 1950s, if you were a woman in the workplace, of course you had the glass ceiling, and also men felt like they could call you honey, or they could maybe tap you on the bottom as you go by, or go get me some coffee, those kinds of things. And women are saying this is not fair, we shouldn't have to deal with this in the workplace. We're human beings, we should be treated equally. And so this hearing of Clarence Thomas, between him and Anita Hill, it creates an American dialogue about this issue. And so it becomes something in the forefront that we start talking about in the 1990s. Next, the GOP is going to start to alienate women voters a little bit more than they've done in the past. Women who are activists, they see how the Republican Party supports Clarence Thomas. They are anti-abortion. They have not supported the ERA. And so we see women increasingly become more and more often Democrats. And so this is something that's pretty troubling for the Republican Party, because it is half of the U.S. population. Next, there's going to be an economic downturn. So Bush is having a lot of problems in his presidency. We have pretty high unemployment. It's about 7%. And so what is causing this? We see that when George Bush and Ronald Reagan say that they're going to cut the size of government, and they start cutting welfare or Medicaid or some of those things, that employs a lot of people who work for the federal government, and so that puts a lot of people out of work. In addition to that, since the Cold War is over, we figure, well, we can reduce the military a little bit. That puts thousands and thousands of people out of work. And so we see that unemployment is rising as we're trying to make the government smaller. The United States also continues to be in debt. So we see the United States government continue to borrow, continue to do deficit spending, and so this is going to frighten investors. With more and more and more of our gross domestic product eaten up by federal spending and borrowing, it makes people less likely to want to invest in American businesses. And so we see some problems in the stock market as people are not willing to invest in those American businesses on the Dow Jones. So Bush is forced to break his campaign pledge. In the beginning, remember, he said he got elected because he promised the American people a very Republican idea that I will not raise taxes on you. He says, read my lips, no new taxes. But because of this budget crunch and the spiraling out of control debt, he goes ahead and he breaks his promise and he says, I will go ahead and raise taxes. This really alienates his Republican Party from him. He's going to have a tough time getting reelected. A lot of Republicans don't like him because he broke his promise. And so we see articles like, read my lips, I lied. Lots of criticism of George Bush. He creates about $133 billion in new taxes. And so we see him mocked in the press. We see political cartoons made about him. And he tries to run for reelection with the bad economy, and he's seen as this person who lied to his party and the American people, he is not going to get reelected.